I want to say welcome to our February Great Presenters program at the Wayland Library. Tonight, we're excited to have Wayland resident Dr. Michael VanRooyen here to talk to us about saving lives 1 million at a time. Michael VanRooyen is the chairman of emergency medicine at both MassGeneral Hospital and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and the enterprise chief of emergency services for the MassGeneral Brigham Health System, where he oversees emergency services for over 500,000 patients. He founded and directs the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and has worked in over 30 countries affected by war and disaster, including Somalia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Iraq, North Korea, and Darfur-Sudan. He also served with the American Red Cross in New York after September 11th, and with the US Secret Service, with NASA, and with the Navajo and Apache tribes in Arizona and New Mexico. He has authored the textbook Emergent Field Medicine and the World's Emergency Room, describing the evolution of modern humanitarian aid and the threats to healthcare workers in conflict. So thank you so much to Dr. VanRooyen for being here tonight. I just have a couple of housekeeping notes. Let me let one more person in. There we go. First, we're recording this session for broadcast on Waycam, our local cable access channel, and for the library's YouTube page. So you'll be able to watch and share with friends. I'm recording my video, Dr. VanRooyen's video, and his slides. Second, Dr. VanRooyen will speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. And you can put your questions into the chat at any point, and I will read them aloud when we get to that. Or at the end, you're welcome to unmute and voice your question aloud. Just know that that will be part of the recording. So now that we've got all of that out of the way and we're ready to get started, I'll hand it over to Dr. VanRooyen.
Courtney, thank you very much. Really great to see everybody, or sort of see everybody. And thanks for joining. If you can make sure you're muted, that would be great. I am going to share my screen and make sure this all works. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. Yeah, I'm a Wayland resident for 15 years. I live just not very far from the library, actually. And so I'm really delighted to talk to people today about one of my actually it's my passion, and the area that I've always really hoped I could have a career in, and really been privileged to have a career in. I'll talk to you a little bit about the confluence of global humanitarian aid. I won't talk much about being an emergency physician. I think being an emergency physician really helps me sort of approach these topics, and I've learned a lot about this particular topic that's really quite complex. So I'm going to go through this discussion today. Let me just make sure I got it. Yep, and talk to you a little bit about really start us off generally and fairly in a fairly straightforward fashion. It'll seem rather elementary, but you'll see pretty quickly how humanitarian aid is not at all simple, and it's quite complicated. Just kind of as a background too, I also teach at Harvard Medical School and at Harvard University at the undergraduate campus, and I run the program, the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. So let's just start out. What I want to talk about today is really define a few terms for you. What a humanitarian crisis is, what's aid, and what does it aim to do? And then we'll talk a little bit about some challenges to effective aid, why it's not quite as easy as it seems like it should be. And then I'll talk about some trends and future aspects about how we're responding to aid in the future, and how we can predict where we're going to give aid, and also to whom and how. And then I'll provide at the end some policy recommendations, or the things that I think can help change the game for the better. So first of all, what is a humanitarian emergency? So when we talk about aid and aid emergency, a humanitarian emergency, it is not the same as a disaster. You can see, like, the World Trade Center bombing, terrorist attack was a disaster, but it didn't create conditions where you need multinational support from external countries to stabilize a condition. So things like Syria, Darfur, or crises in Sudan, Yemen, and things like that are so huge and so sweeping that they create conditions that will cause excess mortality. And if large international assistance doesn't occur, people will die. So humanitarian aid, if you Google humanitarian, You might sort of see certain things about humanitarian, what it is. It's a sort of subjective term, but for our terminology here, we really define a humanitarian emergency based on the event, like an earthquake, the vulnerability, like an earthquake plus poverty, and then divided by or mitigated by the capacity and resilience. So an earthquake in Haiti in 2010, for example, that killed 250,000 people, compared to the same a month later, a Chilean earthquake that killed only about 2,000 people. It's different because of the event is not different, but the vulnerability is significant, and therefore the impact is different. So when we define a humanitarian emergency, we say that it's a humanitarian crisis that causes conditions that require international assistance to stabilize the population. And where it's measured by 2 times the baseline mortality, in other words, there's a certain baseline mortality that we see in any country. And if it escalates to 2 times the baseline mortality, or the potential for mortality, or the potential for things like mass scale human rights abuses, genocide, and effect on vulnerable populations. Those are the triggers that we think about when we decide if something is really a humanitarian emergency. So you can think of a humanitarian emergency being things like the emergency in Tigray right now, in Yemen, throughout South Sudan, the Horn of Africa, and the drought and famine in the Horn of Africa, and many other crises around the country. Around the world. So we now know or have a general idea what a humanitarian emergency is. So what is aid? Like, what does aid aim to provide? Well, simply put, humanitarian aid is sector-based assistance that stabilizes the population. It's things like shelter and water and food and security and healthcare. So those kind of big things you can imagine are the things that will stabilize a population and keep them from experiencing excess mortality. So humanitarian aid is different, though, than relief, and relief is different than development. So, for example, the services that we provide in the humanitarian sector are emergency aid. So think of it, probably an easy way to think about it is that I'm an emergency physician. And as in emergency medicine, we're not the place you go to for your blood pressure check or colonoscopy or even your cancer care. We're the place that you go to in case you get hit by a car, or you fall off of your roof while you're cleaning the gutters, or you have another sort of an injury or an emergency. We're there 24/7 to be available for emergencies. It's different than maintaining your sort of normal health. So humanitarian aid is different than development because we provide rapid scale temporary assistance. So for example, on the left, we would see a relief water supply. In other words, we drop a big water bladder, pump it up and pump it full with water from a nearby source and provide emergency water to people, compared to, say, a well or a borehole that we can provide longer term water strategies. The same thing when we talk about emergency food aid. We provide food aid and emergency nutrition compared to agricultural support in the development sector. And finally, that last lower left-hand side is a bunker emergency hospital providing makeshift medical care versus a hospital that we would equip and have staffed normally. So relief is different than development, and the problems with relief are different. So let's just talk about for a second, who are the responders? You've probably heard of some of these responders before, but it's good to categorize who are the ones that provide humanitarian aid. Okay, we've defined what the humanitarian crisis is: war, conflict, mass scale disaster. We know that it requires emergency assistance. So who responds? Who responds are basically can be categorized by a number of sort of sectors. The UN, typically United Nations agencies, provide funding and coordination and policy. They're not the actual doers. Aside from a couple like World Food Program, they don't deliver aid really. What they do is actually set up conditions and policies by which aid can be delivered. Governments are typically not the deliverers of aid, but they fund aid. So USAID, the British, Australian, the Swedes, and many other countries provide funding for aid. And they're, again, not the ones that are the implementers. The implementers are NGOs, or non-government organizations. Now, there are thousands of non-government organizations, probably 70 or 80% of aid is delivered by the major 10 organizations like CARE, Save the Children, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, and a number of others. But there are many, many non-government organizations and many very local organizations that provide really crucial support. And then finally, aid can be assisted by the military. Now, you might realize right away that military engagement in civilian humanitarian aid could be complicated, right? Because you could actually mix the idea of the mission of the military in military action versus military aid. This is a complexity that we live with in the humanitarian environment, and we can talk about some of the nuances of that. So now we've talked about what a humanitarian crisis is, a big mass scale war, conflict, or disaster. We've talked about what aid is, which is sector-based assistance in an emergency delivery. And we've talked a little bit about who provides aid. So let's say, how hard can it be? How hard can it be to provide food and water and emergency sanitation and housing to people who are suffering from war, disaster, and conflict? Well, it turns out it's complicated. And there's a lot of reasons why it's complicated. I'm going to go through a bit of a litany of why aid is so complicated to provide. First of all, many humanitarian crises, and the worst humanitarian crises, are in settings of conflicts. And these are active military conflicts, oftentimes civil conflicts or transnational conflicts, but they're in areas that are very difficult to reach, very dangerous to reach, and they provide extreme population and vulnerability. So by definition, the places that need aid the most, Yemen, Syria, Tigray, Horn of Africa, areas in the Middle East, these are some of the most complicated places to work. And they are really obstructed in terms of access. So not only can people not move freely, but actually we can't move freely. Aid workers can't move freely. And it ends up being dangerous and quite complicated to gain access. Another one is actually simply scale. So, if I get intimidated by my emergency department's waiting room at Mass General or the Brigham because there's people that are piling up in the waiting room, which I hate, there's nothing like seeing a refugee camp of 400,000 people, or in the case of Cox's Bazar, 1 million people in a refugee camp. These are huge scale operations that require rapid scale up very quickly. And you imagine what's required of an aid agency like Doctors Without Borders or CARE in an acute emergency where you've got 100, 200, 300,000 people streaming across the border, and they need water, food, protection, housing right now. And that scale is really intimidating and really difficult. Another one is the political aspects of aid. This is a shot in Syria where we say it's the humanitarian fig leaf. And that means that a lot of times aid can be a proxy or a replacement for political will. In other words, the US or the UK or the permanent members of the Security Council will not act or will not militarily act to stabilize a situation like Syria, for example, which became a complicated proxy war pretty quickly. And so what happens is that we send in aid instead. But that means aid workers are working in some of the most dangerous settings that are not stable political situations at all. So the political stalemates that can happen and lead to really terrible humanitarian catastrophes are the very places that we send aid workers in to try to stabilize the environment. Another one is the issue for protection. Humanitarian aid agencies are civilian organizations. They are not military. So what they can't do is actually enable direct protection through military force. They can only do so by presence, by actually just being on the ground as an unarmed assistance to populations under threat. And they really have to address the issues of gender-based violence, for example, or violence against vulnerable groups or genocide. And those things are, part of what aid workers have to contend with. Another challenge is actually that novice responders can occur in many places. The example of Haiti is a really sobering one. Haiti, the 2010 earthquake in Haiti led to catastrophic loss of life and tremendous injury. And everybody showed up to help. Now, some of those were really wonderful professional organizations that did really heroic work. as was the work of the Haitian people, who are really resilient. But there were a lot of organizations that happened to be on that 2-hour flight from Miami to Port-au-Prince, and they could just show up and start working without ever really being trained and without ever having any idea of how to coordinate, communicate, or to work. It led to some pretty, I think, egregious care that was given. And speaking of coordination, how to coordinate these rapid scale up of aid, especially with multiple actors, is complicated. It's relatively easy to coordinate aid in a remote place like an earthquake in Pakistan when only professional aid organizations can get there because they know how to work with each other. Haiti was crazy. The tsunami in Southeast Asia was also crazy because everybody came and we had thousands and thousands of organizations and people that were novice responders who couldn't coordinate. So the issue of coordination is actually real and a complex one. The use of data, you would think that we don't have time to get data and use data in the field, especially in an emergency, but I would argue it's the most important time to actually get data, to actually measure what we do and to do it right, because you can't afford to not do it right. So a lot of my work as a scientist in humanitarian aid is actually promoting the ability to get rapid data and to turn it right around quickly so we can use it immediately. Attacks on healthcare has become a serious threat. In my tenure in this field 20 years ago, I was able to move past borders quite fluidly and not really feel like I was being or under threat. But now, because of the sort of erosion of humanitarian neutrality, ambulances, physicians, healthcare facilities, hospitals are directly attacked and targeted because of their apparent complicity with the sort of combative forces. So it's a big challenge, the idea of erosion of neutrality and the attacks on healthcare workers. Finally, the average refugee time that spends outside of their country, you might guess it's a month or it's a year, but it's actually 17 years. So that means when people are displaced across the border and they move to be a refugee, they're actually become a refugee for years and years often. And so this leads to donor fatigue and difficulties in taking care of refugees and displaced people that are utterly dependent on aid, but for years and years and years. And finally, complicated things like COVID. I was just talking to Courtney before this, and I noted that COVID has pushed the humanitarian aid around the world in ways that were really challenging, but also actually might have improved the way we do things. And I'll point that out in a moment. But things like COVID will further complicate aid. So now we've talked about why aid isn't so really easy to give and to provide, and some of the complexities of providing humanitarian aid. Now I want to talk a little bit about what we can think of, what are drivers of humanitarian aid. In other words, if I'm predicting, or I'm trying to predict what kind of aid we'll be giving or where we'll be working in 10, 20, 30 years from now, I might have to actually look at some demographic features in order to predict where I'll be working. And it might seem random. In other words, we might say we could be working anywhere, but the fact is, unfortunately, it's not very random. Actually, we know where we're going to be working, at least in many of the areas that we'll be working in the future. And I'm going to show you a couple maps, and the point of the maps are not to actually be granular, but I want you to sort of get the image of these as we go forward. Because what I'm going to show you is this idea of compounding vulnerabilities that will lead to state fragility. In other words, vulnerability upon vulnerability upon vulnerability that leads a country like Somalia, for example, to have difficulty ever getting into normal development and to be receding back into conflict. And I'll show you what that might look like. First of all, we can start with something like, say, GDP. So the amount of sort of resources per capita in the world, you can see the blue North America and Europe, for example, but low GDP countries are stressed. And you can see right across here, and if you can see my cursor, right across here in the Central Africa, North Africa region, low GDP countries. They're also more fragile countries because they're more fragile for governance, more fragile for development, et cetera. But that's just part of the story. Next would be total fertility rate. In other words, what are the countries that have both low GDP and also high fertility rates? In other words, multiple children and therefore difficulty to manage their population and population wealth. And you can see again, this is going to be in Central Africa, North Africa, and the MENA region, the Middle East, North African region, and a smattering of other areas. Okay, that's another one. Let's look at water insecurity and food insecurity. So water scarcity is something that we can, oops, sorry about that. Did a thing. Let me back up. So water and food insecurity is a big issue as it relates to how are we going to address the needs of the population. Up until now, we don't have a global food shortage. We have a global distribution shortage. In other words, there's no reason for anybody to go hungry in the world today. It's just a distribution issue. But water insecurity and food insecurity are going to create, and climate pressures are going to create conditions whereby there may be someday the ability to not be able to feed the world. Now, fortunately, because of technology and because of the green revolution, a variety of things, we actually have amazing technology to feed the world, but that is the distribution issue remains stressful. And then finally, looking at things like, say, vulnerability to conflict. So there are areas in the world, again, the Middle East, North African region, and some other areas that have vulnerability to conflict. Now, those vulnerability to conflict really means a compounding of all those issues. In other words, bad governance, largely, or unstable governance, and all of the other stressors that we see. So if we keep going, we're going to get to things like state fragility. So state fragility is really the idea that fragile states are on the edge of potentially slipping into or back into conflict repeatedly. Fragile states would be like Yemen, for example, where the population growth exploded. There's tremendous climate pressures, water insecurity, and it's also a proxy war for Iran and Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, Yemen is really challenging, for example, and there are many other countries like that. So if we were going to look at state fragility and a heat map of state fragility, guess what? Central Africa, North Africa, and the MENA region. So this is where we're going to be working in the future. And we know that there are areas in, say, Somalia here, for example, or in Sudan, or in areas in the Middle East. We know that we're going to be facing conflict, state fragility, food shortages, famine, etc. So unfortunately, we do know where we're going to be working. So what are other trends that we have to consider when we're predicting where to apply and where to plan for humanitarian aid in the future? In my field, in working at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, a lot of what we do are try to forecast what aid efforts are going to be needed in the future, and what are the trends that we can contribute to help reverse the sort of trends in major humanitarian emergencies. So one of them is sort of the new conflicts and conflicts that will break out, and looking at state insecurity, the emergence of new conflicts, for example, in Tigray and the Ethiopian war, and areas like that, that there's nothing that creates more population vulnerability and more civilian suffering than war. Out of every single person that's a combatant in a war, 60, 70, 80 people are affected who are civilians. That means babies don't get food. That means kids don't get immunizations. That means women don't have safe deliveries. So war really affects civilians in far disproportionately than combatants. Another one is nationalism. Pardon the cheeky picture, but the idea of nationalism is actually real, and that is that national interests and involuting our stories to look nationally really does pull resources from global events. And it's short-sighted, actually, because indeed, to build global governance, to build global stability is one of our better investments to try to create a stable environment where we can actually have trade and population growth and not responding to emergencies. So the rise of nationalism in many areas is a challenge to humanitarian aid. Another one is the erosion of multinational institutions like the UN. So without funding the UN, or without recognizing the power of the UN, or giving the UN some degree of authority, and that's a broad sweeping term, we're not allowing for sort of global governance. And so we still have nationalism is kind of counter to the ability of empowering the United Nations and the various agencies in the United Nations to really put forth appropriate global governance measures. Population migration and nationalism really plays out in migration. You've seen that, so I'm going to advance, but like the movement of populations around the world and the national and globalization of the refugee crisis. Now this, this points out the fact that actually, say, the Syrian refugees largely go local. They go to Turkey, they go to Lebanon and Jordan. Although we have seen many, and Europe has seen many, we've heard of the crisis or the global refugee crisis, but largely the large majority of refugees actually move within their region. So we only see a tip of that, but it is a great destabilizer of countries like Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Jordan, etc. Another trend is the idea of the sort of protective value of the UN. There's a really interesting study that looked at the cost-benefit analysis of having UN peacekeepers. In other words, is it worth it? Turns out it's actually highly effective and cost-effective to preventing further conflict. So the investment of blue helmets and UN forces, while underfunded, really is a reasonably good investment to try to stabilize conflicted areas. The effect that terrorism has on aid and the obstruction of aid is real and significant. And it also, the attacks on health workers is quite significant, as we've already mentioned. The militarization of aid is also challenging because, again, if we take military actors and put them in a civilian capacity, it may stabilize a population, like, say, in Afghanistan, for example. But in general, civilian aid, I believe, needs to be done and built by civilian organizations to build civil society. Okay, so now we've talked about some of the challenges so far. Now let's talk about some of the multi-threats. In other words, the funky stuff that's happening around the world that is not as predictable. The things that I've talked about so far are actually pretty predictable. We can see those threats. But some of the multi-threats we don't see, and we may not see coming. And gosh, COVID was one of those. Do you imagine, though, if COVID was actually Ebola? So remember, we had the Ebola scare in the United States with a couple people who had US citizens who had Ebola. But the case fatality of Ebola is 40 or 50%. I mean, it's massive. So if there was a global Ebola epidemic, it would change the world radically, far more than COVID did. So we have to prepare for and think about these kind of emerging multi-threat infectious diseases. Another one that we have to think of is climate change. The desertification of the Sahara, the pushing of populations on top of each other, the drying up of resources, and the competition over water is real. The Syrian conflict was partially precipitated by the Anatolian Dam project in Turkey and drying up 70% of the arable land in Syria. So these are not to have better water policies, and global water policies are going to be really important, because otherwise the powerful will take and the poor will suffer. And the next crisis, like, gosh, who knows what's next? I mean, we have, chemical, biologic threats. We have a number of threats. And so, how can we predict the next series of humanitarian challenges? I think some of that is, there are black swan events that we look at and they say they changed the world. And then we kind of look retrospectively and say that we should have predicted them. But there are many things that will be coming down the line that we may have to prepare for. So that's gloomy stuff, right? I just talked to you about all kinds of really difficult things about aid, how it's hard and complicated and hopeless maybe, but it's not hopeless. I wouldn't be in the business of this if it was. And I'm really, have really been, I think, inspired by the work of many really innovative people and organizations and UN agencies and NGOs in the past, such that I've really given much of my career to this. So if we're thinking of the future of aid, how can we turn the tide? How can we fix it? How can we make it better? And how can we prevent the suffering of, civilians across the globe who are really subject to humanitarian emergencies? And this might seem crazy, but what does academics have to do with anything? In other words, I'm like a Harvard professor. What can a Harvard professor, that's not a self-portrait, by the way, have anything to do with humanitarian aid? And it's kind of why I started Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and started it 15 years ago, because I believe actually that we can do a lot to push and impact the humanitarian environment. And this can be categorized by things like policy initiatives that we can push forward and encourage. We could practices and strategies we can put forward, and kind of investments. And I'll just talk to you about some of the things that we are hoping to contribute to, and also things that need to be done to invest in better aid. So first of all, global policies. Global policy is about, we're really looking more carefully at this thing called the nexus. Now this is jargon, actually. So it's UN humanitarian jargon, but it makes sense, actually. Development is all those things that I told you about later on. The relief is humanitarian aid is this emergent care, and longer term development strategies are different. And we've got to merge those things too, so that they can actually be seen as contributing to peace and security. So this humanitarian development peace nexus is really how we take programming that we provide emergency humanitarian aid, but then transition it effectively to longer term developmental priorities. That is an elusive task, actually. It seems like it should be easy, but it is not. Another one is really targeting assistance to fragile states. And it's really hard to assist countries in war, but to assist and identify specifically fragile states diplomatically and through political assistance and development assistance, really look at that. And part of the analysis of what makes a fragile state and what kind of investments can be useful or something that we work with our policy counterparts with. Another one is actually aid localization. What this means is, and what I mentioned this with COVID a while ago, COVID stopped us from traveling to places that we typically would work. So we'd work in Afghanistan and we'd go to Yemen and we go to places around the world, but COVID really shut that down. And it was probably in many cases good that it shut it down, because it turns out that sending people from the West or people from global humanitarian workers from Europe and around the world into sites like this is not efficient. So what we really learned is that we really needed to accelerate the development of local organizations, local leaders, and local people who, by the way, are just better at this stuff. So localization really is an investment into the local participation and growth and expertise of people who can provide aid. Now, the furtherance of this, or the expansion of this, is decolonizing aid. So instead of having this rich Western white powers impact aid around the world because we have the money and we are driving the agenda, we have to really take and seriously take ways to look at not being the ones to develop the strategy, but actually to provide funding, but actually let the strategy and insist that the strategy be developed by countries that are using aid and neighboring countries. So the idea of decolonizing aid is complicated, but it is something that we have to talk about in order to provide better ways to localize aid and to get the drivers of aid out of the West and into areas that really are the stakeholders. Policies that promote water cooperation, we mentioned, these huge dam projects in Egypt and Turkey, et cetera, really have massive impact. These issues have to be addressed because they will cause further vulnerabilities. So secondly, so those are some policy issues, and what kind of strategies that can we do to really understand how we can improve aid. Some of them are looking specifically at climate risk and looking at climate resilience strategies. What things work in some countries and how can they be translated to others? We're very active in this area. We work in Southeast Asia a lot, especially in natural disaster prone areas, water insecure or water so flood prone areas, to help take lessons learned in one community and have it be applied across the nation and across other nations. So the idea that we can learn from each other and look really seriously at climate risk and mitigation strategies. Another one is really getting serious about global epidemic surveillance. This requires investment. Like there's just no way around it. The places that we need to make sure that we invest in are places that have weak infrastructure for looking at monitoring infectious diseases. And the investment in, epidemic surveillance in the Congo, which is typically the heart of Ebola, is really well placed. So we have to really invest in strategies to understand this network of global surveillance so that we can actually monitor infectious diseases and stop them as they spread. Another one is really, doing our best to try to get sort of effective aid and advance the effectiveness of aid and coordination of aid. I believe one of the strategies of this is actually building the next generation. So what we do a lot of is leadership development, understanding how to professionalize aid. That's me sort of lurking in the background, by the way, in Haiti. And how do we find ways of advancing professionals, not just from the US, not from Europe, but all around the country. So we have many aid agencies that are working locally that engage in kind of leadership development programs. Another one is expanding the evidence base, and that is the use of data. Now, it seems like that would be a no-brainer, but frankly, we've been in a data-free zone in many cases. When aid is often done in the past, 20 years ago, nobody collected data, they just did stuff. So really the use of data and for monitoring, evaluation, assessment is really critical. And we've gone a long way to be able to use and expand the evidence base. So we're actually giving evidence-based humanitarian aid. And then finally, the link to that is the advancement of technologies. And our program does a lot to actually advance humanitarian technologies in a lot of fronts. This is sort of drone delivery of blood. Actually, I'm not sure how it's a sexy technology. It's interesting, but it is probably quite limited in utility. But there are many technologies that are actually really amazing and really transformative. The cell phone is the biggest one. Aid has really completely changed actually in the last few years, where a large percentage of humanitarian aid that is delivered to people is delivered to individuals and families in person or on their phone by the transfer of money. So cash-based programming is a revolution in humanitarian aid that has really occurred in the last 10 years. So if you were displaced, for example, and you were, would you like some clothing? Yeah, sure. Would you like a house? Yeah, sure. But what you really want is money, because money, you can buy what you need when you need it. But it's important, of course, to get the money to the right people at the right place. And so there's a lot of technical issues around getting cash to people. But with mobile currency, for example, and cellular coverage being almost or growing to be ubiquitous, cash and cash-based programming is critical, and it is a revolutionary feature in aid. And beyond mobile phones, there's just so much more that we can learn about how people access information, they share their networks. It's really interesting. We did a study to look at refugees in Iraq, and people would rather go without meals and without sort of anything else than rather than give up their cell phone, because that's their lifeline. It's how they have money, it's how they have their contacts, it's how they have their network, and how they have their lifeline. So the ability to use technologies, not just mobile phones, but biometric data, et cetera, is really crucial to the future of aid. But that also means that we have to protect data. So one of the big challenges in using mobile technology to deliver aid is leaking data and data breaches. The International Committee of the Red Cross had a big data breach recently. And so the idea of using applications like blockchain, for example, that allow more protected forms of digital identity, cash transfer, logistics, microinsurance, et cetera, are really going to be important to protect and assure data security. And go figure, crypto. Like, you'd never thought that aid is going to be really driven or use cryptocurrency, but you imagine, the stability of many places in conflict and the stability of local currency is so unstable that actually, at some point, whether it's Bitcoin or some emerging cryptocurrency, will provide a more stable form of currency. TBD, but it's certainly being entertained by big funders like the World Bank. And then expanding connectivity. In other words, making sure that people using these data and using their phone and connecting really have connectivity. We can see that there's still many data-free zones around the world. but this is changing. There's a big investment into making broadband coverage and coverage in areas of the world that can get it. Because it's really crucial for the future of aid. It's crucial for the future of development. It's crucial for economic growth. So finally, and then I'll take questions and happy to. I know I've burned through a lot of topics, but I wanted to just first of all, thank you for listening, and secondly, tell you that I've been really inspired by this work, because if this work was easy, then there'd be easy solutions. But humanitarian aid in many cases is fairly straightforward in its moral imperative to me. We have a moral imperative to provide assistance to communities in crisis. It needs to be done. It's part of humanity, and it's part of the sort of duty that we have. But the provision of aid is difficult and complicated. And so I'm really proud to have been in the field and really humbled to be working with people who really do the hard work in the field. So with that, I'd love to take your questions. I'll stop sharing, and maybe Courtney can help me moderate the million questions you may have. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. VanRooyen. We do have a whole bunch of questions.
Okay.
I'm going to start with a really simple one. If you were talking to a high school kid who was super excited about your presentation and wanted to get into this, what are all of the fields that are coming together, like in your center or on the ground? I mean, you sound like an international relations expert, but you're an MD. Like, what are all of the pieces of expertise that you need?
So everything, actually. So humanitarian aid is a huge, and development is a huge field that requires economists, requires management and leadership and public health and medicine and nutrition experts. So if you were really interested in this field, I think getting some basic understanding of international relations, I think would be useful. And then getting into the field, you apply for jobs in non-government organizations and UN and World Bank and USAID and things like that. So I think whether you're in medicine or public health or any specific technical discipline, at the end of the day, international relations will be a path that you could use to sort of advance your kind of understanding of this field.
Thank you. Then I'll go to one of the first questions that came up, which you addressed partially in your presentation, but how does climate change factor into your planning strategy for future humanitarian aid?
Yeah, but actually prominently for a couple of reasons. The funder donor strategies are really focusing on climate issues. And so when we think of climate issues are an overlay for kind of everything that happens: climate migration, climate related conflict, water scarcity, increased refugee movements. And so a lot of what we're thinking about now is how do we look at resilient strategies of communities, and also using technologies to, say, monitor wastewater analysis in refugee camps as it changes so we can better detect cholera epidemics, or how do we use lessons learned from the Philippines, coastal areas of the Philippines, to apply that to flood prone areas in India and Sri Lanka and Indonesia, et cetera. So lots of uses of technology, lots of uses of mapping, a lot of ways that we assist other organizations to really address climate issues. So there are just many forms of climate challenges that require kind of our work.
Thank you. And another sort of current event trend, does the rise in misinformation and disinformation interfere with your efforts?
Yeah, that feels like the big black swan event, honestly, to me. Like, the erosion of truth and the erosion of the trust in data is incredibly powerful. We have a disinformation sort of workshop in Eastern Ukraine, which is the hotbed of the kind of Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And it is a techno warfare there. It's really amazing. And there is so much misinformation, but it is everywhere. So much of this work that I'm preaching all the time is to try to continue creating the validity that data matters and that data should speak, and that we really try hard not to be political, but to let the data speak. but it is really a challenge. It is really a huge issue.
Thank you. Let's see, Steve's question, how much greater do you think the need for humanitarian aid will be in 10 years? Two times, 4 times? And how do you get to that conclusion? And then how do you get the world appropriately organized for that increase?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think if we look at a trend analysis, has the need for aid increased? The answer would be yes. I think that we've seen, growth year upon year of the need for humanitarian aid. And actually, I think, humanitarian aid is not efficient. It's not the efficient way. Actually, prevention is more efficient. Just like in my field of medicine, I'm in emergency medicine, but I would say that emergency care is not necessarily efficient. It's life-saving and it needs to be there, but it's not the way that you're going to assure the health of the population. Same thing with aid. So I would say that we can expect the need for aid to increase. I'd expect that there's going to be increasing obstructions to aid that will complicate aid delivery. So in 10 years, perhaps double. I would hope not. And the real mitigating strategies to prepare for this are like certainly preparing to spend more, but also to prepare to invest in resilience strategies and preparedness strategies.
Okay. Just a quick, simple one. Does UNICEF provide aid?
Yes. So UNICEF is a children's fund based in New York. It's a UN agency, and it provides large-scale children's programming. It funds a lot of children's programming efforts, and it also does some direct aid too. So UNICEF will have immunization campaigns, for example, around the world, but it also funds other programs and implementers to do aid.
I'm going to throw one in there, my own curiosity. When you go to a place of disaster, like for you, how long are you there? Where do you stay? How does that work logistically in your experience?
Yeah, it really depends on the organization and the effort. And my role is not typically to work in the setting as a doctor. I'm a doctor, but generally, while I have worked in a lot of areas abroad, most of my work is organizational. And so if I respond to a setting like going to Darfur, for example, or going to Iraq, I'll have a special sort of mission to go. It will either be to gather information and evidence. It will be to design a program and to recruit other organizations to help. It'll be to meet people to understand their priorities. So most of my work now, it used to be that I go for months at a time. Now I go for a couple of weeks at a time when I go, because I'm much more on the sort of planning, policy, strategy side. So certainly it's different based on the crisis or the organization with whom I'm working, or the kind of need at the time.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to put one more from the chat, and then if anyone wants to unmute. Oh, I see a raised hand. So I'm going to read one question, then it'll be Thomas's turn. That's the question asks, what can someone who's working or close to retirement or retired do to help beyond or rather than writing a check or donating money?
Yeah, a great question. I think, the most aid that is provided, there's a lot of aid that's provided by, individual donors, but a lot is provided by government support. Some of it is actually becoming educated on the issues. Some of them is actually reaching out to your political actors, congressmen, senators, et cetera, because they will have something to do with the way that aid gets apportioned. So having a campaign for reaching out to understand, like, what are we doing about Tigray, for example? These are really complicated crises, but they, in my opinion, require diplomatic engagement, and that sometimes takes pressure, and that pressure can take engagement with bodies that, congressional bodies, et cetera. Another one is actually just getting to know the issues so that we can actually be educated consumers. But a lot of it is, and then, if you have a skill that you can lend to an organization, sometimes there's technical skills that you have, that's maybe possible too.
Thank you. Thomas, if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Great, thanks. Hi, Dr. VanRooyen. I work at Partners in Health and study international relations at Harvard Extension School. I took your online class on humanitarian response to conflict and disaster, which was fascinating.
Oh, thanks.
Really cool to have this opportunity to talk virtually in person. My work at Partners in Health is focused on the idea of aid localization as it relates to development communication, such as photography. I come from the photography world primarily.
Yep.
So focusing on local expertise of people telling their own communities' stories authentically. So basically decolonizing aid by decolonizing storytelling for an NGO. I was curious, since you've done so much work on this, what are some specific ways you've found to be effective when it comes to that kind of leadership development and professionalizing aid that you mentioned? Particularly, I work with people overseas to try to help them become better photographers and better storytellers, rather than flying someone from America across the sea.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's great. And PIH is a great organization, and they work squarely in the development space largely. But the idea of contributing to localization and decolonization is, in some ways it's a bit of a buzzword right now, but it's actually a really, really important concept. And I think some of the things that I would say, I mean, just like you're doing, that are effective are building local capacity in everything, in management, in leadership, in communications, in strategic development. And then actually the decolonization part of that is actually relinquishing control of the money. So at some point we have this Western philosophy that we think they're gonna just eat it up and it's all corrupt and they can't spend it. Turns out we got our own share of corruption on our side. And so I think the idea that not only building local capacity, but then letting it go and letting the flow of aid funds go, I think is going to be really an important feature. So great work. I mean, congrats. It's really important work.
Thanks. You too.
Does anyone else have a question they wanted to ask aloud? You can feel free to unmute. There's one more question in the chat that I skipped over by accident, and maybe the person who asked it will want to clarify, but do you work with any organizations that provide legal guidance on international regulatory issues?
Yes and no. I don't do much of that sort of international regulatory issues on the legal side, but there are a lot of really compelling needs on the regulatory front in terms of like treaties as it relates to infectious disease surveillance, for example, and global surveillance treaties. Another really important one is anti-terrorism legislation, because that really obstructs aid in a huge way. So organizations who want to be able to provide aid, but get obstructed because of anti-terrorism legislation. So there's a lot of legal issues that come into this. Certainly there's international humanitarian law and international human rights law as well when it comes to accessing populations. But gosh, think of anything that we do. I mean, anytime that we gather information from cell phones of recipients, I mean, the data protection requirements, for example, and the ways that communities have recourse if there's a breach. There's many legal issues, just like in any discipline.
Thank you. Last chance, if anyone has any other questions.
Courtney, I have a question. It's Bob Ayer. Mike, this was in the chat box, but I'd be interested in your response. The question was, how do you deal with corruption challenges when thinking about decolonizing and localizing aid?
Yeah. So I think, one huge advancement, as I mentioned before, was the distribution of cash. You imagine the distribution of cash would be in a pre-electronic era, it would just be really fraught with difficulty, like literally giving bags of Somali shillings to people, right? Or in many areas of corruption, the delivery of aid in Somalia, for example, is notoriously difficult because in order to gain access, you have to pay $40,000 just to show up. So there is a lot of aid, what we call aid diversion and corruption. And so it shouldn't be an impediment. In other words, we have to build structures and the ability to provide aid to the local population that needs it. And technology is actually a wonderful way to leapfrog that. So the ability to have an office on the ground that understands populations, determines need, creates criteria for need and secure distribution of cash is a revolution. It's a revolution. And it really averts a lot of the corrupt behaviors that have happened in the past. But certainly you think of the overhead that an organization, I'll pick a good one like CARE International, right? CARE is a wonderful, huge organization, but gosh, layers of bureaucracy that require the central office and then the local office and the regional office and warehousing and aid distribution. That the amount of aid that actually gets in the hands of people is so much more when you can do just direct delivery of cash. You have to be careful. Cash doesn't always work because it could be a disrupted, economic environment, or markets could be collapsed. But you can do aid, cash plus other aid as well. So there's some really good ways to sort of avert the possibility of corrupt behaviors. But that being said, they're out there.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I'm putting a link to Dr. VanRooyen's Harvard Humanitarian Initiative in the chat, and also a link to our next presentation in March, which swings a whole different direction, working under pressure, ocean exploration 7 miles down. So don't miss that one on March 1st. And I want to say thank you so much to Dr. VanRooyen for being here this evening. For
Well, thank you
great
all
presentation.
for hanging with me on this one, and really appreciate the attention. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you. Everyone have a great night.
Good night.
Bye.